At my son's lakeside wedding in Michigan, just as the orange glow of the sunset kissed the water, I received a proposal I never expected from the groom. Garrett, my son's soon-to-be husband, leaned in with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, $50,000, Ms. Walker. Pay up to be part of this family. Otherwise, you quietly fade away. Before I could respond, my son, Mason, chimed in with champagne in hand. Or enjoy bingo night at a retirement home. Your call, Mom. There I stood, on a rented wooden deck at Lake Crystal, surrounded by fairy lights and white hydrangeas, staring at the two people I had once called family. They looked flawless, untouchable in their designer suits and calculated charm. But they had forgotten something. I smiled, lifted my glass and said softly, "You forgot one thing." The breeze lifted the edge of my shawl. Their smirks faltered for a split second. They didn't know I'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. They believed I was alone, that I was weak, easy to erase. But what they didn't know was that I, Ellen Walker, had rebuilt my life once before, and I could dismantle theirs silently, without raising my voice. So I excused myself to the restroom. And as the music swelled behind me, the storm they had summoned began to unfold. The rain in Chicago that night felt colder than usual. Not because of the temperature, but because of the silence inside my home. My name is Ellen Walker, and I was 28 when I made the decision that would change the course of my life forever. My then-husband, Tom, had passed out drunk on the living room couch. His usual ritual after another night of shouting, rage, and slurred apologies. My cheek was bruised again, but it wasn't the pain that made me move. It was the look in my daughter's eyes. 4-year-old Mason stood in the hallway in her flannel pajamas, holding her frayed stuffed rabbit, eyes wide, silent. She didn't cry anymore. She had learned at that age that silence was safer. That was it. That was the moment. Not the broken dishes, not the slammed doors, but her silence. I moved like someone possessed, grabbed an old duffel bag, threw in Mason's favorite hoodie, some granola bars, our passports, and a hollowed-out copy of Little Women I'd used to stash away every dollar I could save. It was $243, scraped from coupon savings and unclaimed tips at the diner where I waited tables. I scooped up my daughter, and she wrapped her arms around me like she'd been waiting for this. "Are we going on an adventure, Mommy?" she whispered. "Yes, baby," I replied, fighting tears. "The biggest adventure of our lives." We vanished into the rain that night. Boarded a Greyhound bus to Rockford, Illinois, where my old friend Melissa, now a single mom herself, let us crash on her couch for a few nights. It was cramped, but no one screamed. No one raised a hand. 2 weeks later, I found us a one-room apartment above a bait shop. Smelled like cigarettes and mildew. The heater clanged and the floor creaked, but it was ours. I worked 2 jobs. Mornings at the diner from 6 to 2, and evenings at a dental office answering phones until 9. I was always tired, always running on fumes, but Mason was safe. And for the first time in years I could breathe. I remember those early mornings when she'd wave goodbye as I left and draw little hearts in crayon on the fridge for me to find. Those drawings were my fuel. Every plate I served, every phone I answered, every blister I endured. I did it because I had a reason now. A reason to build something better. Years later, that little girl got into the University of Wisconsin on a scholarship. She danced around our tiny kitchen like she'd won the lottery. I cried that night not just from pride but from fear. How would I cover what her scholarship didn't? The answer was painful but clear. My retirement fund. Modest but consistent, built dollar by dollar across decades. I sat down with Melissa again, now a paralegal, and told her I was ready to cash it out to help Mason start the dream we'd both built toward for years. But Melissa had one condition. "You get 51% ownership," she said firmly. "She's the face, but you're the foundation. Protect yourself." And so, Mason signed the partnership papers without blinking. Her eyes too focused on her boutique dreams. And I let her shine. I stayed in the background, stocked shelves at night, paid unexpected bills in silence, and watched her grow. But the truth. The journey didn't begin at that boutique launch party. It didn't begin when her name showed up in lifestyle magazines. The journey began that night in the cold rain, when I chose to rewrite our story with nothing but a duffel bag, a crumpled bus ticket, and a burning refusal to let fear define our lives. That was the real beginning. And that's the part they'll never put in glossy magazines. Mason's boutique, Mason and Sage, didn't make waves at first, but it made memories. Nestled in a small corner unit on Oak Street in Madison, Wisconsin, the storefront had exposed brick, creaky wood floors, and a large window that Mason decorated with every ounce of heart she had. I helped too, always quietly, sweeping after hours, steaming dresses, restocking shelves while she strategized about branding and customer flow. She worked 14-hour days without complaint, often falling asleep on the tiny cot we'd kept in the back office. Then everything changed. One afternoon, a local lifestyle influencer, Alexa Green, walked in and tried on a cobalt blue sheath dress. She posted a photo with a flattering caption, and by morning there was a line outside the boutique. By the end of that week, Mason had sold out. Just like that, Mason and Sage was a name people began whispering in cafes and writing about in local blogs. Soon came the interviews, the features, the influencer shoutouts. 6 months in, Mason began eyeing the vacant space next door for expansion. She talked about modern lines, minimalist displays, brand collaborations. I listened from the sidelines, proud but invisible, always entering after closing hours, wearing the same old sneakers and cardigan, never wanting to steal even a flicker of her spotlight. "Mom, you should come during the day sometime," she'd say with a half smile, barely looking up from her tablet. "This is your world," I'd reply. "I'm just happy to see it thrive." Then came the night everything shifted. I arrived earlier than usual to surprise her with takeout. I didn't want to intrude, so I waited quietly by the back racks. Mason was at the counter, speaking to a well-dressed customer who admired the boutique's style. "How'd you pull this off right out of college?" the woman asked. Mason laughed gently. "I built it from nothing," she said. "Just hard work and a clear vision. Nobody handed me anything." Her words hung in the air, sharp and sterile. Felt them like a slap. I didn't say a word. I just left, with the paper bag still in my hands and my heart heavy. That night, standing alone by the alley's loading dock, I realized something painful. I was no longer a part of her story. Not even a footnote. She had erased me, not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. In her world of polished marble and curated Instagram moments, there was no room for a mother who once scrubbed diner counters and gave up her retirement to fund a dream. Still, I said nothing. I kept showing up in the background. Kept believing. Then Mason met Daniel Harrington at a networking gala. He was everything she thought she wanted. Well-dressed, wealthy, and fluent in the language of deals and leverage. Within weeks, she was swept into his lifestyle. Rooftop parties, Napa tastings, weekends in Palm Springs. When she spoke, it was all buzzwords. Daniel says we can scale. Daniel knows VCs. Daniel thinks we need global reach. I learned of their engagement through Facebook. There she was, smiling beside him, diamond flashing in the sun, captioned with "Forever starts now." There was no call, no visit. But worse came later. I found her laptop open one evening and read a file Daniel had labeled FMS Strategy. It was a cold, calculated plan to extract more funding from me while minimizing my presence in their lives. In bullet points, like I was an obstacle, not a mother. They had built a palace, and decided I was too dusty to walk its halls. That was the night I called Sarah, my old friend and legal partner. "I need to know my rights," I said, calm but resolute. Because I hadn't just given Mason a check. I had signed a binding partnership. 51%. The foundation she'd chosen to forget was still beneath her polished floors. And if they were going to treat me like I was disposable, then they had forgotten one thing. I still held the keys to the castle. The beach was picture perfect. Cape May's golden sand glowing under fairy lights, waves murmuring their approval. Guests murmured with glasses in hand, violins played soft jazz, and Ellen stood quietly near the floral arch where her daughter Mason had just said, "I do," to Daniel Harrington. She hadn't been asked to speak. She hadn't been acknowledged. Then, as the last rays of the sun dipped behind the horizon, Daniel leaned toward her and said in a voice too polished to be sincere, $50,000, Ellen. Consider it the price of admission. Otherwise, you disappear from our lives for good. Ellen blinked. Not from shock, but because she'd known this moment would come. Before she could reply, Mason chimed in, champagne in hand. Or enjoy the peace and quiet of a retirement home. Your choice, Mom. They thought they had her backed into a corner. Instead, Ellen smiled, a calm, collected smile, and raised her glass. You forgot one thing, she said softly, her voice barely louder than the sea breeze. And with that, she excused herself. Not toward the restroom, but down a path between the dunes, to a quiet bench facing the ocean. There, she pulled out her phone and typed a single message to her longtime legal ally, Sarah. Sandcastle time. The response came instantly. Understood. Legal team is ready. Are you okay? Ellen stared at the horizon. I will be, she replied. 7 minutes later, the unraveling began. Across the venue, sealed envelopes were quietly delivered to David's parents, to guests, to boutique investors, all of whom had unknowingly become entangled in a web of unauthorized deals Daniel had orchestrated. Inside, legal notices of immediate audit, asset freezes, and contract nullifications, signed under Ellen's name, still the 51% majority owner of Mason and Sage. The effect was swift. David's father stood up mid-toast, face flushed with fury. Guests began whispering. Phones buzzed. Mason's company email had auto-sent legal notifications to board members and vendors. The polished illusion cracked like porcelain under pressure. Mason rushed over, her smile gone. Mom, what's going on? I'm getting emails about the boutique. It's not emails, Ellen said, looking her daughter in the eyes for the first time in what felt like years. It's accountability. I'm exercising my rights as majority owner. David appeared beside Mason, jaw tight. You don't know who you're messing with, he muttered. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Ellen replied, cool as ever. A man who funneled boutique funds into his personal real estate gamble because he didn't have the guts to ask his own father. Mason's eyes welled. We were going to pay it back. Please, Mum. We just needed time. I gave you time, Ellen said. I gave you everything. And you erased me. As David stormed off to deal with the fallout, Ellen stood still. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was finished. With each step away from the reception, she shed decades of self-sacrifice, of being the silent helper, the backup plan, the invisible backbone. 3 miles down the coast, Sarah waited in a gray sedan. Ellen climbed in, barefoot, sea breeze in her hair. You ready? Sarah asked. I'm not going back, Ellen said simply. And she didn't. In a small town outside Portland, she opened her own shop, a cozy space filled with warm light, honest people, and zero apologies. She didn't need revenge. She had peace. And for the first time in her life, that was more than enough. It wasn't the wedding on the beach, or the boutique's grand opening, that marked the beginning of Ellen Matthews' story. It was a stormy night in a cramped Boston apartment, nearly 3 decades ago. She was just 28, young, bruised, and done pretending. Her husband, Tom, had passed out on the couch, his anger finally spent. The TV hummed with static, but the real silence was inside her, the kind that comes after too many apologies that meant nothing. Her cheek was sore again, swollen from his rage. But it wasn't the pain that made her move. It was the look in her daughter's eyes. 4-year-old Mason stood barefoot in the hallway, pajama sleeves too short, gripping a stuffed bear that had seen better days. Her eyes didn't hold tears anymore, just quiet, tired acceptance. And that broke Ellen more than any punch ever could. In that moment, something inside her snapped, not in fear but in clarity. She moved quickly, as if her hands belonged to someone else. An old gym bag was pulled from the closet. She packed what she could, some clothes, snacks, their passports, and a copy of Pride and Prejudice with $237 tucked inside. cash she'd quietly saved from grocery trips and waitressing tips. "Are we going on an adventure, Mommy?" Mason had whispered, her arms wrapping around Ellen's neck. "Yes, baby," Ellen said, holding back tears. "The biggest one yet." They slipped out into the Boston rain and caught a night bus to Dorchester, where an old high school friend offered them her couch for a few nights. It wasn't much, but it was safe. 2 weeks later, they moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment that smelled of boiled cabbage and cigarette ash. The heater groaned, and the bathroom barely fit one person. But no one screamed. No one threw fists. And Mason slept through the night. Ellen hustled. She worked the breakfast shift at a local diner from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., then changed into a thrift store skirt to answer phones at a dentist's office until 9. On weekends, she stocked shelves at a small department store. Exhausted. Always. But she could finally breathe. She wasn't just surviving. She was rebuilding. And Mason thrived. She studied, made friends, won scholarships. Ellen watched her daughter blossom, first into a bright student at Boston University, then into an ambitious young woman with dreams of launching a fashion boutique. She came home with sketches, ideas, business plans. "I just need help, Mom," she'd said one night. "It's a storefront. It's perfect. But I need $97,000 to get started." Ellen didn't hesitate. Every month, she had tucked away a little money into a retirement account. Not for vacations. Not for luxury. Just for security someday. And someday had arrived. With help from her longtime friend Sarah, now a paralegal, Ellen signed over the funds, but not without protections. "You're still the majority owner," Sarah said, drawing up partnership papers. "Just in case." Mason barely skimmed the fine print. She was too busy dreaming. Ellen stood in the back of the boutique's grand opening, hidden behind racks of designer clothes, watching her daughter shine. The lights sparkled, the champagne flowed, and for a while it all seemed worth it. No one in that room knew the truth. That it all began on a rainy night, with a duffel bag, a bruised cheek, and the quiet resolve of a mother who had finally said, "No more." For the first 2 years, Mason's closet was more struggle than success. Rent scraped the bottom of their margins, and the boutique's sleek Instagram image often hid the truth. Late nights, unpaid bills, and more than a few tears behind closed doors. But Ellen Matthews was always there, quietly propping it all up. She never demanded credit, never asked to be seen. While Mason posted polished reels and mingled with influencers, Ellen restocked the inventory after closing, balanced the books, and paid surprise plumbing repairs out of her own dwindling funds, always discreetly. She'd walk home in the cold with aching feet, her old sneakers worn thin, but her heart steady, because her daughter was building something. And that meant everything. Then came a twist no one saw coming. A college acquaintance of Mason's, an up-and-coming lifestyle influencer, posted a single picture in a cobalt blue sheath dress from the store. The next morning, a line snaked down the sidewalk. Just like that, Mason's closet went viral. Orders flooded in. Magazine features followed. Influencers dropped by, casually. In 6 months, Mason was negotiating for the vacant space next door. She walked taller, dressed sharper. She spoke of expansion, brand partnerships, and one day, global presence. Ellen stayed in the shadows by choice. She'd visit after closing, bringing homemade soup or backup receipt paper. "You should come during store hours, Mom," Mason would say, but always off-handedly, never truly inviting. "This is your world," Ellen would reply with a soft smile. "I'm just happy to see it grow." But one evening, Ellen arrived early with takeout in a paper bag, hoping to surprise Mason. Instead, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. A woman at the counter admired the boutique and asked, "How did you manage all this right out of college?" Ellen stood quietly behind a rack of blazers as Mason answered, bright, beaming, proud. "I built it from scratch," Mason said. "Just hard work and vision. No one handed me anything." The words cut deeper than Ellen expected. She didn't say a word. Just turned, walked out, and stood outside the store under a street lamp. Her hands trembled, the soup bag still clutched in her fist. That night she didn't cry. Not because she didn't feel the betrayal, but because something even more painful had settled in her chest. She had been erased. Not out of malice but out of vanity. Out of a need for a cleaner story, a shinier narrative. Mason's new world had no room for Ellen's calloused hands, her clearance rack clothes, or the long nights she spent cleaning bathroom floors to make rent while Mason studied marketing theory. Ellen wasn't in the boutique's origin story. She was simply missing. And that quiet realization, after years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and silent devotion, was the first flicker of change. Not in anger, but in clarity. Because Ellen had built her daughter's dream on the bones of her own. And somewhere along the way, she'd disappeared from the picture entirely. Ellen first met David Harrington at the Chamber of Commerce Gala where her daughter, Mason, was being honored as one of Boston's top young entrepreneurs. It was a grand event. Crystal chandeliers, linen tablecloths, waiters with trays of champagne. Ellen had borrowed a navy blue dress from the clearance rack and spent the afternoon at a discount salon, trying to make her hair presentable. David was everything Mason's new life seemed to demand. Well-groomed, confident, and born into a family that spoke in investment portfolios and vacation homes. He shook Ellen's hand with just enough warmth to be polite, but his eyes didn't linger. They never do when they think you don't belong. From that night on, Ellen saw less and less of her daughter. Mason wasn't ignoring her on purpose. It was more insidious than that. Calls became short, visits were skipped, and when they did talk, the conversations were peppered with phrases like "David's parents think," or "David says scaling requires global vision." The girl who once dreamed aloud over homemade spaghetti was now quoting business jargon and floating words like equity and exit strategy. Ellen watched quietly. She'd seen this kind of man before. Charming on the outside, calculating underneath. David had a way of speaking that sounded like praise but left no room for disagreement. He didn't just want to support Mason. He wanted to shape her. When the engagement was announced, it wasn't through a phone call or family dinner. Ellen found out the same way thousands of strangers did, on Facebook. A sparkling diamond on Mason's hand, a carefully filtered beach photo, and the caption, "I said yes to forever." No tag. No text. No warning. That night, Ellen sat in her kitchen with a cup of lukewarm tea, rereading the post like it might change the third time through. Then came the message. A screenshot accidentally forwarded to her from one of Mason's friends. David, texting Mason, "Your mom can't sit with my family at the dinner. My parents would be horrified. Put her at the vendor table." The words stung, but the silence afterward hurt more. Mason never defended her. Never pushed back. Just followed up with a completely unrelated text about overpriced eucalyptus branches for the wedding decor. Ellen didn't even know what to respond. She visited Mason's apartment that evening, hoping for clarity. But Mason wasn't home. And on the open laptop at the kitchen counter, Ellen saw it. A file titled FMA Management. Inside, strategies for keeping her out of the spotlight, timelines for requesting more money, and a note in David's cold phrasing. "After the wedding, it'll be easier to create distance." Ellen closed the laptop slowly. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't thoughtless anymore. It was planned. They weren't just forgetting her. They were writing her out of their lives. She had given her life to building Mason's dream. And now, piece by piece, they were dismantling the story, pretending she'd never been part of it. David had turned her daughter into a polished, smiling version of herself, one that no longer had space for the woman who carried her through every storm. Ellen stood there in that quiet apartment, the weight of betrayal heavier than any burden she'd carried before, and she knew, for the first time, that she couldn't stay silent much longer. The sun was setting over Cape Cod, casting a golden hue across the sand as music floated through the salt-tinged air. Guests were seated, champagne flutes in hand, and white flowers swayed in the breeze. On the surface, it was a picture-perfect beach wedding. But Ellen knew better. She watched her daughter, Mason, glide between tables in her custom gown, David glued to her side like a polished accessory. When they reached Ellen's table, tucked near the caterer's tent and far from the Harringtons. They didn't smile. They didn't hug. Instead, David leaned in, voice low and sharp. $50,000. Consider it a small fee to stay part of this celebration. Otherwise, you disappear after today. Ellen blinked. Before she could answer, Mason, her only daughter, took a sip of champagne and added, "Or you can enjoy your solitude in a retirement home." "Totally your call, Mom." There was no shouting, no gasping. Just a moment, still suspended like the tide holding its breath. Then Ellen smiled. She lifted her glass slowly, locked eyes with both of them, and said in a calm, almost amused voice, "You forgot one thing." They blinked. Just enough hesitation for Ellen to spot the crack in their performance. That flicker of fear was all she needed. "I need to powder my nose," she said lightly, her heels clicking confidently across the wooden deck. But Ellen didn't go to the restroom. She walked to the edge of the dunes, took out her phone and typed one message. "Sandcastle time." Within minutes, her attorney Sarah responded. "Understood. Documents are delivering now. Legal team on standby." Ellen returned to the reception like a shadow moving through candlelight. Quiet. Observing. And then the storm hit. Across the venue, waiters began discreetly handing sealed envelopes to guests. Investors, vendors, board members. David's father was first to react, his face hardening as he read. Conversations turned hushed, tense. Phones buzzed. Ellen had activated the clause in her 51% ownership, freezing assets, initiating a full audit, and sending alerts from the boutique's official email account. Business under review. All operations temporarily suspended. Mason rushed to Ellen, face flushed with panic. "Mom, what is happening? Everyone's freaking out." "I'm protecting my investment," Ellen said evenly. David appeared behind Mason, his calm mask gone. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he growled. "Oh, but I do," Ellen replied. "That's why your father is talking to those two people over there. Because he just found out his son was embezzling funds from a women's boutique to fund a real estate pipe dream." Mason's voice cracked. "We were going to pay it back. We just needed a little time." Ellen stepped closer. "And you were going to buy that time by discarding me?" Mason's eyes welled with tears. "But I'm your daughter." Ellen hesitated, just for a second. Then she whispered, "Exactly. And this is what you did to your own mother." Without another word, she turned and walked away, not out of anger but clarity. The game was over. The lies had unraveled. Ellen wasn't the one losing family that day. She stepped off the deck onto the cool sand, shoes in hand, the breeze brushing her cheeks. Somewhere north of the city, a quiet new life waited for her, one not built on sacrifice or survival, but peace. And for the first time in decades, Ellen was no longer someone's safety net, someone's source, someone's afterthought. She was simply herself. And that, finally, was more than enough. Ellen didn't look back as the soft waves kissed the shore behind her. She had given them everything, her time, her love, her savings, her silence. But now, under the fading light of a wedding that was never meant to celebrate her, she was reclaiming what mattered most, her self-worth. No longer the woman who hid behind balance sheets and gift-wrapped sacrifices. She walked barefoot toward a future she didn't need to explain to anyone. Her heart was no longer a ledger of debts owed and love withheld. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was free. A small storefront waited for her in a quiet town. No spotlights, no speeches. Just her own name on the lease and a little corner of the world built not on sacrifice, but serenity. Ellen didn't want applause. She didn't want revenge. She wanted peace, and she had finally chosen it. Let Mason chase image. Let David scramble to rebuild. Ellen had nothing to prove anymore. She had already won the moment she chose to walk away. Sometimes the loudest form of power is silence. The strongest form of love is letting go. And the greatest victory, choosing yourself when the world keeps asking you to choose everyone else.